The ancient Greeks held very specific ideas about what the most beautiful being in the world should look like. Aphrodite was not merely beautiful, she was the very essence of beauty, brought to life. Her golden locks, like threads of molten sunlight, caught the morning rays, and her skin possessed a flawless smoothness, reminiscent of a precious pearl's nacre. Her gaze was like the deep blue of a summer ocean. However, beyond her dazzling physical form, an unseen aura emanated from Aphrodite, transforming everything around her and imbuing it with an unparalleled charm. The sea foam caressing her sparkled like a scattering of diamonds. Ordinary seashells at her delicate feet suddenly appeared as rare gems. Even the gulls soaring overhead seemed to fly with particular grace when she was near. The moment Aphrodite first touched the shore with her feet, wondrous flowers bloomed in her footsteps. These were not just random plants, but magnificent roses, the most exquisite and fragrant anyone had ever seen. It seemed as if Gaia herself, Mother Earth, solemnly marked her arrival in the world. Yet what was particularly intriguing about this significant event was the uniqueness of her birth. Aphrodite emerged fully grown, endowed with a comprehensive understanding of her essence and the boundless power she possessed. Unlike helpless mortal infants, who must learn everything from scratch, she instantly recognized her divine status and understood that her sacred domain was love in all its countless manifestations. And this love, as Aphrodite would soon discover, was far more multifaceted and complex than merely bringing happiness to human hearts. The first thing that captured her attention was how her divine presence immediately and profoundly affected all living creatures around her. A pair of dolphins playfully frolicking near the shoreline unexpectedly began to perform an intricate mating dance, leaping from the water and circling in its azure expanse with astonishing grace and synchronization. Two gulls, previously fiercely disputing a small fish, suddenly forgot their quarrel and began to gently preen each other's feathers. Even the plant world responded to her unseen influence. Vines, previously stretching in opposite directions, suddenly began to elegantly intertwine. Mighty trees, which had stood in solitude, now leaned their branches towards their neighbors, as if seeking friendly companionship and connection. However, Aphrodite sensed something entirely different, deeply permeating the very essence of the cosmos. It was an all-encompassing feeling of loneliness that pervaded every corner of this world. In the boundless oceanic expanses behind her, she perceived the poignant isolation of creatures that wandered alone through the immense depths. On the vast land stretching before her, she felt the longing of animals and spirits who had never known the comfort of true companionship. And what was most striking, she was able to perceive the subtlest emotions of her fellow gods, though she had never met them face to face. Somewhere in the distant realms of existence she sensed Zeus's tangled feelings about power and the heavy burden of responsibility. She felt Hera's internal struggle, torn between passionate love and burning jealousy. She even detected the profound loneliness of Artemis, who had consciously chosen a path of solitude, but sometimes inadvertently wondered what she was missing in that choice. It was at that fateful moment that Aphrodite made a decision destined to profoundly influence both the divine pantheon and mortal humans throughout all coming ages. She decreed that her purpose was not merely to symbolically embody love, but to actively create favorable conditions for its full flourishing. She decided to start small, with the creatures immediately surrounding her. The goddess gently encouraged dolphins to find their mates. She provided unseen assistance to lonely seabirds in finding life partners. Moreover, she even subtly influenced ocean currents to help bring together fish that had previously swum in isolated solitude. However, as she moved along the shoreline, exploring this newfound world where she had come into being, Aphrodite gradually realized that love was not always a simple blessing. She observed a pair of crabs fiercely clashing in a battle for territory, and understood that sometimes the desire to protect what one holds dear can lead to irreconcilable conflict. The goddess saw a mother bird aggressively chasing away other feathered creatures who dared to approach her nest, and understood that love is often inextricably linked with feelings of possessiveness and burning jealousy. But her most striking discovery was the realization that her very divine presence could become a source of undesirable complications. As she passed by a school of young dolphins, they all immediately and unreservedly fell in love with her, abandoning their previous attachments and steadfastly following her along the coast. It was then that she had to learn to masterfully control her influence, to use it thoughtfully and purposefully, rather than allowing it to indiscriminately and without discrimination affect all beings in her vicinity. This became Aphrodite's first and most crucial lesson about the immense responsibility inextricably linked with her divine powers. Being the goddess of love was not merely about making everyone fall in love with everyone else. It implied a deep understanding of the delicate balance between fervent desire and sincere respect, between all-consuming passion and unshakable wisdom, between bringing souls together and granting them the freedom to independently choose their life paths. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Aphrodite realized that she had to find her rightful place among the host of other gods. She was born with the knowledge that there were other immortal beings like her, each with their own sphere of influence and unique temperament. But she also clearly understood that her arrival would inevitably change the dynamic of their relationships in ways no one could predict. For what happens when the goddess of love enters a family already burdened with its share of tangled and complex ties? What happens when a being endowed with the power to influence the deepest emotions joins an assembly of powerful entities who are far from always adept at managing their own feelings and passions? Aphrodite paused at the very edge of the water, gazing at the boundless sea that had given her being, and then turned her gaze towards the land, where an entirely new chapter of existence awaited her. The wind gently played with her golden locks, and roses continued to bloom luxuriantly at her feet. She was the embodiment of beauty, power, and immortality. Yet, in a certain sense, she felt utterly alone. She was one of a kind, a unique being whose very essence was pure, unadulterated love. How, then, can one build genuine relationships when one's very presence automatically and involuntarily influences how others perceive and relate to one? How can one discern true care and affection, distinguishing them from a mere reaction to one's divine nature? These profound questions Aphrodite carried in her heart as she took her first steps from the cradle of the sea to majestic Olympus, where the other gods, still unaware of the coming changes, awaited the arrival of embodied love. And perhaps these existential questions continue to trouble humanity to this day. How can we achieve a harmonious balance between the deep desire to be loved and the urgent need to remain authentic, true to our real nature? How can we learn to recognize the true sincerity of our feelings towards another person, separating it from a mere reaction to external, superficial attractions? And how is it possible to genuinely love others while unshakably preserving one's own unique identity. These reflections on self-identity and authenticity inevitably lead us to the narrative of one of the most terrifying and fateful trials Zeus, the supreme god of Olympus, ever had to face. This was a battle that tested not only his formidable might, but also his undisputed right to rule over the entire cosmos. For sometimes the greatest threats arise not from treacherous family betrayal or tangled romantic complications, but from the depths of pure, primordial forces of chaotic destruction. By then, Zeus had successfully overthrown his father, the mighty Cronus, freed his siblings from the dark prison in their father's belly, and firmly established himself as the ruler of the gods on the sacred Mount Olympus. One might think this would have been an ideal time for Zeus to finally relax and fully enjoy the fruits of his grand victory. However, contrary to expectations, it was during this period that Gaia herself, the embodiment of Earth, decided to challenge and test whether Zeus was truly worthy of his newly acquired throne. The truth was, Gaia, the primal mother of Earth, had watched with bitterness for generations as her children and grandchildren fought amongst themselves. First, Uranus had shown unimaginable cruelty towards his offspring. Then Cronus had ruthlessly overthrown Uranus. And now Zeus had just as mercilessly overthrown Cronus. Gaia was exhausted by this unending cycle of family violence, and it particularly angered her that Zeus had imprisoned many of her other children, the mighty Titans, in Tartarus, the deepest and darkest abyss of the underworld. Therefore, Gaia made a firm decision to create an invincible warrior who could crush Zeus once and for all. Her goal was not to take his place on the throne, but to put an end to the vicious cycle of violent power struggles, completely eradicating the very idea of divine rule. She retreated into the most secluded depths of the Earth's interior, where the rock formations remained molten, and the air trembled and shimmered with unbearable heat. There, in that hidden grotto, illuminated only by the glints of subterranean lava flows, Gaia began her most daring and ambitious creation. She gathered clay from the abyssal ocean trenches, mixed it with primeval fire from the very core of the planet, and breathed into this monstrous creation all her furious wrath, deep disappointment, and unyielding desire to put an end to divine tyranny. What emerged from this monstrous process was a creation unlike anything the world had ever seen before, and hopefully will never see again. His name was Typhon, and he was conceived as the perfect embodiment of an anti-god. Imagine the most colossal mountain peak you can possibly envision. Now imagine that this mountain is capable of moving, thinking, and burning with all-consuming hatred. Typhon was so immense that when he straightened to his full colossal height, his head seemed to scratch the celestial bodies. His eyes blazed like two miniature suns, emitting an ominous light. Instead of hair, his head was covered with a swarming mass of writhing snakes, each possessing venom potent enough to kill 100 mortals with a single bite. But perhaps the most nightmarish sight was his arms. From the elbows down, instead of conventional limbs, Typhon had 100 dragon heads. Each of these heads could unleash its own form of destruction. Some breathed incinerating fire, others lethal poisonous gas, and still others a chilling wind capable of turning any living creature into frozen ice in mere moments. The moment Typhon first erupted from the depths of the earth, his mere appearance, his colossal ascent, triggered powerful earthquakes that shook the entire known world. His terrifying roar, emanating not only from his monstrous maw, but also from all 100 dragon heads, was so deafening that it toppled mountains and caused avalanches thousands of miles away. When the Olympian gods first beheld the approaching Typhon, their initial reaction was not to stand and fight back. Their instinct was to flee, and as swiftly as possible. And we are talking about those very gods who had valiantly battled the Titans, who commanded lightning, controlled earthquakes, and ruled over the underworld itself. However, Typhon represented something entirely different. Something unprecedented. He was not merely a powerful creature. He was the pure embodiment of chaos, destruction for destruction's sake, a harbinger of the complete end of everything they had so painstakingly built. One by one, the majestic Olympian gods hurried to Egypt, where they skillfully concealed themselves, taking on the guise of various animals, just to escape the piercing gaze of the terrible Typhon. Thus Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, transformed into a graceful fish, gliding through the waters. Apollo, the patron of light and arts, turned into a wise raven. Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, took the form of a graceful cat. Even the mighty Ares, the ruthless god of war, transformed into a wild boar, seeking refuge in the most remote corners of the Nile Delta. However, Zeus, the supreme lord of Olympus, was the only one among the divine pantheon who did not succumb to panic and did not flee. And it was not at all that he was alien to fear. Ancient legends unequivocally testify to his profound terror of Typhon. The reason for his steadfastness lay in a deep understanding, inaccessible to other gods. He realized, if he retreated from this decisive battle, if he allowed Typhon to turn Olympus and all their great creations into ruins, then Gaia, the progenitor of all existence, would achieve her sinister goal. The era of the gods would end, and the world would plunge back into primeval chaos. And so Zeus, solitary and resolute, stood on the highest peak of Olympus, his lightning crackling in his mighty hands, anticipating Typhon's arrival. When the battle finally erupted, it surpassed anything humanity had ever witnessed. Zeus, with thunderous majesty, hurled lightning bolt after lightning bolt at Typhon. Each strike was so blindingly bright it could blind mortals, and so deafening that its echo reverberated across the world. Typhon, however, seemed barely to notice. The electrical discharges left only scorched marks on his rough, stony hide, but did not slow his monstrous advance in the least. Meanwhile, Typhon's 100 dragon heads spewed their various destructive forces at Zeus. Fire capable of melting even bronze, venom that withered vegetation for miles around, and chilling cold powerful enough to freeze the very air. Zeus had to exhibit all his incredible speed and agility to avoid certain death in the very first moments of this grandiose confrontation. The battle raged, lasting days, then weeks. The incessant roar of Zeus's lightning and the furious bellowing of Typhon's heads generated monstrous storms that flooded entire regions. The heat emanating from their titanic struggle melted snowcaps on distant mountain peaks. The earth trembled, cracked and crumbled under the impact of their crushing blows. But gradually Zeus began to realize that brute force alone would not secure victory in this fight. Typhon was simply too powerful, too resilient, too overflowing with destructive energy. Each time Zeus thought he had gained an advantage, Typhon unleashed some new, unpredictable form of attack, forcing the supreme god to once again resort to defensive maneuvers. It was at this critical moment that Zeus recalled the ancient words of his grandmother Gaia, spoken long before they became sworn enemies. She asserted that the earth itself was an inexhaustible source of strength, but also that the earth could be turned against those who sought destruction rather than protection. Therefore, instead of trying to destroy Typhon directly, Zeus decided to employ a different tactic. He began to use his lightning not as a weapon of lethal striking, but as a tool. He struck the ground around Typhon, not attempting to harm the monster itself, but instead triggering colossal landslides and avalanches. At first it seemed pointless. Typhon simply pushed through the falling rocks as if they were ordinary pebbles, but Zeus persistently continued to strike, continued to cause landslides, continued to pile stone upon stone, and gradually, very gradually, the rocks began to accumulate around Typhon's feet, forming a growing barrier. It took Zeus another week of continuous lightning strikes, but eventually he managed to bury Typhon up to his waist in loose rock and debris. The monster still fought fiercely, still spewed destruction from his dragon heads, but his mobility was completely hampered. It was then that Zeus made his final, desperate gambit. Instead of trying to kill Typhon, which might have been impossible anyway, Zeus used his power over earthquakes to split the earth directly beneath the buried monster. Then, with a lightning bolt more powerful than any he had ever summoned, he brought an entire mountain down on Typhon. The mountain that fell on Typhon was none other than Mount Etna, and according to ancient Greek lore, Typhon is still imprisoned beneath it. Every time the volcano erupts, they said, it is because Typhon is still there, still enraged, still spewing fire, and desperately trying to break free. But what is particularly remarkable about this ancient story is that Zeus achieved victory, not through superior physical strength over Typhon, but through his sharp mind and strategic thinking. He won by demonstrating patience instead of mere brute force, by contemplating each step rather than simply fighting with reckless fury. When the other gods finally returned from Egypt and found Zeus standing exhausted but triumphant on the ruins of the battlefield, they asked him how he had managed to overcome a creature that had terrified them all. Zeus's answer was simple and wise. I defeated him not by being more powerful. I defeated him by remembering what I was fighting for. And perhaps this profound lesson resonates not only in ancient mythology. Sometimes the greatest challenges that arise on life's path cannot be overcome simply by trying harder or becoming stronger. At times they require us to pause, carefully consider the situation, and remember what truly holds paramount importance for us. This idea of needing to remember what we are fighting for leads us to one of the most celebrated heroes in all of Greek mythology, and to the narrative of how sometimes the most important battles are not fought against monsters, but against the systems that, in essence, give rise to these monsters. Let us now transport ourselves from the realm of the gods to the world of mortals, to the beautiful island of Crete, where King Minos reigned, possessing wisdom, untold riches, and a terrible secret hidden beneath his majestic palace. This secret was called the Labyrinth, and it was the most complex and intricate structure ever built. Created by the ingenious master craftsman Daedalus, it was a sprawling underground network of corridors, dead ends and false passages so cunningly designed that anyone who dared to enter it would become hopelessly lost within minutes. And at the heart of this gloomy labyrinth dwelled something that should never have existed, a terrifying creature named the Minotaur. The story of the Minotaur itself was a true tragedy, born of divine punishment and human deeds. King Minos had once incurred the wrath of the god Poseidon, and the Sea Lord's revenge took the form of a curse that caused Minos' wife to fall passionately in love with a sacred bull. From this unnatural union the Minotaur was born, a creature with the body of a mighty man but the head of a bull, possessing human intelligence but driven by a bestial, insatiable hunger. King Minos, overwhelmed by shame and horror at this living reminder of his family's curse, commissioned Daedalus to build the labyrinth as a prison for the monster. The Minotaur could never escape, but it also could never die, never find peace, never be anything but a monster trapped in eternal darkness. But here is where the story takes an even more tragic turn. To feed the Minotaur, King Minos imposed a terrible tribute on the prosperous city of Athens. Every 7 years, Athens was forced to send 7 youths and 7 maidens to Crete, where they were thrown into the labyrinth to be hunted and devoured by the Minotaur. Imagine what this meant for Athenian families. Every 7 years, 14 families lost their children to this terrible fate. The victims were chosen by lot, meaning that every family with young people lived in constant fear that their son or daughter might be chosen next. It was in this desperate situation that our hero Theseus stepped forward. Theseus was the son of King Aegeus of Athens, but he had grown up far from the royal palace, raised by his mother in a small coastal town. He had only recently arrived in Athens and learned of his royal lineage. Therefore, when the time came to send the 3rd tribute to Crete, Theseus witnessed this heartbreaking tragedy for the first time. He watched as 14 young Athenians were chosen by lot. He saw their families weeping, saw the resigned despair in the eyes of the victims themselves. He listened as older citizens explained that this was simply the way things were, that there was no point in fighting King Minos and his monster. But Theseus, being young and not yet worn down by years of accepting the unacceptable, asked a simple yet insightful question. Why don't we just refuse to send the tribute? The answer, as he learned, was that King Minos' fleet was too powerful. If Athens refused to send the tribute, Minos would invade and utterly destroy the city. It was better to sacrifice 14 young people every 7 years than to risk the complete annihilation of all. This logic completely failed to satisfy Theseus. Instead, he made an announcement that shocked everyone, including his own father. He would volunteer to be one of the 14 victims and kill the Minotaur. King Aegeus was horrified. He had only just been reunited with his son, and now Theseus wanted to throw his life away on what seemed an impossible task. Dozens of young people had already been sent into the labyrinth over the years, and no one had ever returned. Many of them had been trained warriors. What made Theseus think he could succeed where they all had failed? Theseus's answer revealed something important about his character. He said, "I may not be able to kill the Minotaur, but I can make sure I am the last person to die trying." You see, Theseus had a plan that went beyond simply fighting the monster. He carefully studied everything known about the labyrinth, talking to Daedalus's former apprentices, learning about its design and layout. He believed the real problem was not killing the Minotaur, but getting out of the labyrinth afterward. So, when the ship carrying the 14 victims arrived in Crete, Theseus carried not only a weapon, but also a ball of thread. But before we get to the famous thread trick, there's another part of this story that's often overlooked. While Theseus was preparing for his fateful confrontation with the Minotaur, he caught the attention of someone completely unexpected. This person was Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos. Ariadne had grown up knowing about the Minotaur, knowing about the terrible tribute, knowing about the young people who disappeared into the labyrinth every 7 years. But she had never met any of the victims before. They were always kept away from the royal family, treated more like sacrificial animals than human beings. Meeting Theseus changed her perception of the world. For the first time, Ariadne found herself face to face with a man condemned to die to satisfy the hunger of a monster born of her own family. But unlike countless other victims, Theseus was not prepared to accept his tragic fate. He harbored plans of resistance, intending to fight back. This realization plunged Ariadne into a profound moral crisis. On one hand, she had the opportunity to save Theseus's life by showing him the way through the intricate labyrinth. On the other hand, such an act would inevitably mean betraying her father, King Minos, and potentially condemning her own family to disfavor if her treachery were discovered. Ultimately, Ariadne made a decision that determined the entire course of her future life. She concluded that some societal norms are so terrible that they cannot be upheld, even if fighting them threatens the loss of everything she had ever held dear and familiar. On the night before Theseus was to enter the gloomy labyrinth, Ariadne secretly made her way into his cell. She brought him an invaluable gift that the great Daedalus himself had once given her. It was a ball of magical thread, possessing an astonishing property. It always led back to the starting point, no matter how far it unraveled into the endless corridors of the labyrinth. "Tie one end to the entrance," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the silence of the chamber. "Unwind it as you advance deeper into the labyrinth. When the monster is vanquished, follow the thread back to freedom." But Ariadne gave him more than just a guiding thread. She shared with him detailed knowledge of the Minotaur's habits, information that only someone who had grown up within the palace walls and was close to the royal family's secrets could know. She told him that the monster was significantly stronger during the day but became sluggish and slow at night. It was almost blind, yet possessed an incredibly keen sense of smell, capable of detecting prey from afar. The Minotaur was cunning enough to set traps, but at the same time, its pride was so great that direct challenges caused it to abandon any strategy in favor of brute, primal force. The next morning, Theseus stepped into the labyrinth, carrying not only Ariadne's thread and her invaluable knowledge, but also the heavy burden of hope for all those who had ever lost their loved ones to King Minos's cruel and unjust system. The labyrinth proved even more disorienting and treacherous than he could have imagined. The walls were riddled with false doors and deceptive symbols designed to confuse any traveler. The corridors twisted, branched, and doubled back in a way that utterly defied all logic and common sense. Even with the magical thread, which was supposed to show the way back, Theseus found himself constantly losing his spatial orientation. However, he continued to go deeper and deeper into the heart of the labyrinth, following the faint, heavy breathing of the Minotaur and the stronger, repulsive smell of old bones and all-consuming fear. When he finally reached the center of the labyrinth, Theseus found himself in a circular chamber, illuminated by a single ray of sunlight piercing from above. And there, sleeping on a pile of human bones, lay the Minotaur. The monster turned out to be smaller than Theseus had expected, yet it looked more human. The creature's body was that of a mighty man, scarred from countless battles, but in its movements it still retained a wild grace. Only the head was truly monstrous, a massive bull's head with horns sharp enough to pierce even bronze armor. For a moment, Theseus hesitated. Before him was not merely a mindless monster, but also a victim of circumstances, a creature that had never chosen to be what it was, forever trapped in utter darkness and forced to feed on unwilling victims. But then Theseus remembered all the young people who had died in this chamber, and realized that showing mercy to the Minotaur would mean continued death for future innocent souls. The battle itself proved shorter than anticipated, but by no means easier. The Minotaur fought with the desperation of one who had been too long imprisoned, deprived of freedom and hope. But Theseus fought with the resolve of a man bearing the hopes of all who had ever been sacrificed to uphold an unjust and cruel system. When it was all over, Theseus followed Ariadne's thread, retracing his steps through the winding passages to the exit of the labyrinth. Behind him followed the remaining 13 Athenian youths and maidens, who had waited at the entrance, barely daring to believe in the possibility of salvation. However, Theseus's story does not end with his escape from Crete, for killing the monster was only the first step in changing the system that had created the monster in the first place. And in this, perhaps, lies the most important lesson of this ancient tale. Sometimes true courage is not found in direct confrontation with a monster. It lies in taking on the long, arduous work of building a world where such monsters are no longer necessary. Imagine for a moment the most extraordinary headache in the history of the universe. You wake up one morning, and it feels like your head is about to split open from unbearable pain. But you are Zeus, the all-powerful king of the gods, so your headaches are never ordinary. This morning on Olympus began like any other. Helios, the sun god, was just beginning to guide his fiery chariot across the heavens, painting the marble columns of the great palace with a soft golden light. Zeus paced the halls of his home, one hand pressed firmly against his forehead, trying to comprehend this strange sensation that grew stronger with each passing day. The truth was, several months ago, Zeus had received an unsettling prophecy. The Fates, those ancient sisters who spun the threads of destiny, had whispered something that made even the mighty thunder god ponder. They foretold that Metis, his first wife and the goddess of wisdom, would bear him a child who would one day overthrow him from his throne, just as Zeus had once overthrown his own father, Cronus. Zeus, being Zeus, acted as he thought logical at the time, though to us it sounds quite strange. He swallowed Metis whole, believing that in doing so he would prevent the prophecy from being fulfilled. But wisdom, it turned out, was not so easily contained or consumed. Even inside Zeus, Metis continued to carry their child, and this child continued to develop, learn and grow in the most unusual cradle imaginable. For several months, Zeus felt the child moving, thinking, and even crafting something inside his head. One can only wonder what it's like to feel someone building things right inside your skull. The sound of tiny hammers striking metal echoed in Zeus's mind day and night. It seemed the child was already working, already creating, already preparing to emerge into the outer world. This morning, however, the sensation became utterly unbearable. Zeus summoned Hephaestus, the god of fire and metalworking, who was also his son. Hephaestus arrived at the palace with his bronze axe, still warm from the forge's heat, with soot on his strong hands, wondering why his father had summoned him so urgently. "My head," Zeus simply said, and Hephaestus instantly understood. Gods have a way of comprehending things without lengthy explanations. Hephaestus had anticipated this day, even dreamed of it in his workshop during quiet afternoons, when the only sounds were the rhythmic strikes of hammer on anvil. They stood together on the highest balcony of the palace, where the morning air was thin and clear. Below, the mortal world went about its daily concerns. Farmers tended their olive groves. Fishermen mended their nets. Children played in dusty courtyards. None of them suspected that they were about to become unwitting witnesses to the birth of a goddess. Hephaestus raised his axe and with one precise, careful blow split Zeus's forehead open. What happened next was so extraordinary that even the other gods, who had seen many strange things in their long lives, ceased their conversations and froze in astonishment. From Zeus's head emerged a fully grown woman, already clad in shining armor that seemed to be forged from starlight itself. Her helmet caught the morning sun and reflected it in brilliant rays, dazzling those around her. Her spear was perfectly balanced, and her shield polished to a mirror sheen. This was Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, born not as a helpless infant, but as a perfect being, ready to immediately take her place among the gods of Olympus. But what made this moment even more remarkable was that Athena's first action was not to speak or move, but to think. It was visible in her grey eyes, in the way they carefully observed everything around her. She studied the palace's architecture, noting how the columns were placed and why. She tracked how light moved across the marble floors, and instantly understood the mathematics of that movement. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and measured. "Father," she said to Zeus, "I now understand why I was kept safely within your thoughts. There is much work to be done in the world." Zeus, rubbing his now healed forehead, smiled with relief and pride. What is particularly fascinating about Athena's birth is how it reflects the core values that the ancient Greeks cherished most. She was born not of passion or chance, but of thought itself, of pure reason. She emerged fully formed because wisdom does not come gradually, in pieces. It arrives whole, ready to face whatever challenges await. In the days that followed, Athena explored Olympus with the curiosity of one seeing the world for the first time, yet with the profound understanding of one who had contemplated it for months. She visited Hephaestus in his workshop and learned about craftsmanship and construction, instantly grasping the intricacies of the trade. She conversed with Apollo about music and poetry, immediately understanding how rhythm and meter work together to create beauty. But most of all, her attention was drawn to the mortal world below. From her high vantage point, she saw cities struggling to organize themselves, people trying to solve complex problems of law and governance, artisans striving to perfect their craft. It was here that her wisdom was needed most. The first city Athena decided to offer her assistance to was the one that would later bear her name, Athens. The people there were fiercely debating how to organize their society, how to make decisions that would be fair to all citizens. Athena watched their discussions with deep interest, noting how they grappled with questions that seemed to have no simple or obvious answers. She appeared before them not as a conquering deity, but as a wise teacher in the city's central square. She demonstrated the arts of pottery, weaving, and olive cultivation. These were not random skills chosen at whim. Each represented a particular kind of wisdom vital to a flourishing society. Pottery taught patience and the understanding that useful and beautiful things could be shaped from ordinary earth. Weaving showed how individual threads, properly organized and intertwined, created something far stronger and more beautiful than any single thread, symbolizing unity and cooperation. And olive cultivation demonstrated long-term thinking and foresight, as olive trees take years to mature but then provide food and oil for many generations. The people of Athens deeply absorbed the significance of these lessons. They began to perceive their city not merely as an ordinary dwelling place, but as something they could actively transform and perfect through thoughtful analysis and tireless effort. They developed innovative systems of governance, refined mechanisms for collective decision-making, and advanced educational approaches that emphasized the development of critical thinking and logical understanding of complex issues. It is quite remarkable how the rays of Athenian enlightenment spread far beyond the polis. News of the wisdom flourishing in Athens reached the ears of other cities, prompting them to send envoys to study its cutting-edge practices. These visitors returned to their homelands inspired by fresh concepts concerning urban planning and architecture, the structure of society, and the resolution of disagreements through dialogue rather than the application of brute force. However, the goddess Athena never sought to claim credit for these achievements. When grateful citizens expressed their appreciation, she invariably emphasized that true wisdom has always resided in the depths of the human soul. She merely facilitated the organization of their disparate thoughts, just as her own emergence became the embodiment of Zeus's ideas, transforming them from a chaotic collection into something utterly clear and purposeful. Reflecting on this, as evening descends and consciousness drifts into sleep, one might contemplate the wondrous moment of the goddess Athena's birth, realizing that at times the most significant insights and accomplishments do not stem from external sources, but from the internal organization of existing knowledge and experiences. How many concepts and designs are maturing in each person's mind, awaiting their hour to appear in their full completeness and perfection? What knowledge might be revealed tomorrow, having invisibly formed in the hidden corners of consciousness, ready to illuminate the path and aid in a deeper understanding of the world around us. Expanding on this profound thought about the essence of wisdom and the true values of human existence, it is fitting to turn to the narrative of a ruler who was convinced he clearly understood his desires, but who was destined to realize that the fulfillment of cherished aspirations does not always turn out to be the good that is imagined in dreams. In ancient times, the ruler of Phrygia was King Midas, whose lands now stretch across modern-day Turkey, where gentle hills were thickly dotted with sprawling olive groves and fertile vineyards. The monarch's majestic palace proudly overlooked the picturesque valleys, where shepherds leisurely drove their flocks along ancient paths, and trade caravans made their way along dusty tracks, delivering exotic goods from distant lands. Although his kingdom was peaceful and quite prosperous, Midas often found himself, upon surveying his extensive treasuries, experiencing an insatiable desire to possess even greater riches. It should be noted that Midas developed, one might say, an irresistible passion for inventorying his possessions. Every morning, having just broken his fast with honey cakes and fresh goat's milk, he would hasten down the cool stone steps into the depths of his treasury. There his fingers would glide over glittering piles of silver coins. He would lift intricately crafted golden goblets to catch the light of the oil lamp, and he would meticulously arrange precious stones in neat rows. The melodic clinking of metal and the barely audible rustle of stones became a kind of symphony for him. A symphony celebrating abundance, for, as Midas soon realized, wealth possesses a rather paradoxical quality. The more one possesses, the more acutely one feels the absence of something else. His personal treasury, once appearing magnificently full to him, now began to seem disappointingly meagre in comparison to the legendary treasures of other powers. Tales reached his ears of Egyptian pharaohs, whose tombs were filled to the brim with gold, of Persian rulers whose crowns were encrusted with precious gems the size of birds' eggs, and of mighty merchants who commanded entire fleets of ships laden with untold riches. On one particularly scorching day, as King Midas strolled leisurely through his fragrant rose garden, striving for a moment to distract his mind from intrusive thoughts of gold, an unusual rustling sound reached his ears, emanating from behind the garden fountain. His vigilant guards discovered a sleeping man among the lush roses. It was an elder with leaves woven into his hair, and wine stains on a simple yet worn tunic. He turned out to be Silenus, the renowned satyr and loyal companion of the god Dionysus. Silenus, having indulged excessively in the previous night's revelry, had strayed from Dionysus's procession and eventually fallen asleep in Midas's royal garden. Most monarchs would likely have shown indignation upon discovering an uninvited guest in their private domains, but Midas, on the contrary, was intrigued by this extraordinary visitor. For 10 days, Midas extended a warm welcome to Silenus, treating him as the most honored guest. They shared meals on the palace terrace, watching the setting sun paint the distant mountain ranges in magnificent hues of gold and purple. Silenus, in turn, recounted his countless wanderings in the company of Dionysus, describing grand feasts in distant cities, vineyards whose fruits yielded wine so sweet it could bring tears of joy to mortals, and revelries that lasted from one new moon to the next. However, what struck Midas most in these tales was the fact that they never concerned the accumulation of material possessions, but were wholly dedicated to the experience of unique moments. Silenus vividly described ideal evenings, when melodies and carefree laughter seemed to lift people above their everyday worries, of humble meals that acquired a magical charm by being shared with loyal friends, and of dances that lasted until the first rays of dawn, for no one wished for that pure joy to ever diminish. When Dionysus himself arrived to retrieve his faithful companion, he was so delighted by Midas's hospitality that he offered the monarch any reward he desired. "Whatever you wish," Dionysus declared, and a peculiar mischievous sparkle appeared in his eyes, such as gods sometimes display when they sense that mortals are about to make quite interesting mistakes. Without the slightest hesitation, Midas voiced his cherished dream. "Grant me such a boon that everything I touch instantly turns into pure gold." Dionysus raised an eyebrow, expressing doubt, and inquired if Midas was truly so certain of his choice. The king, with unfeigned enthusiasm, nodded affirmatively, already mentally envisioning the pleasing weight of golden coins, the dazzling gleam of golden statues, and the boundless golden treasures that would soon become his undisputed possession. Dionysus granted his wish with an almost nonchalant gesture, as if swatting away a bothersome fly. "It is done," he simply uttered. Soon after, he and Silenus departed, leaving Midas alone with the miraculous power he had acquired. The first test proved to be quite minor. Midas extended his hand and gently touched a rose growing in his garden. In that very instant, the delicate petals of the flower transformed into solid, brilliantly shining gold. This metamorphosis was magnificent in its own way. Every minute detail of the flower was flawlessly preserved. Every curve of every petal was captured in the precious metal with astonishing precision. However, the rose no longer emitted its sweet fragrance, nor did it gently sway in the breeze. It had become a perfect, yet utterly lifeless replica of itself. Despite this, Midas was consumed by an uncontrollable ecstasy. He began to tour his palace, touching everything within his reach. Ordinary chairs transformed into golden seats, fabric curtains became golden tapestries, even the stones beneath his feet turned to gold with every step. By evening his palace appeared as if woven from the boldest dreams. Everything sparkled, everything was precious, everything was valued more than other kingdoms. However, the true difficulties began during dinner. Midas, exhausted from his day of golden transformations, sat down to eat. He reached for a succulent grape, but it instantly hardened in his fingers, turning into pure gold. He attempted to drink wine, but the beverage solidified, transforming into a metallic liquid the moment it touched his lips. Bread, honey, and even plain water, everything he tried to consume turned into inedible gold the very instant he touched it. On that fateful night, Midas lay on his golden bed, surrounded by golden pillows, gazing at the gilded ceiling, and felt a tormenting hunger gnawing at his stomach. The bitter irony of his situation did not escape him. He was, perhaps, the richest man on earth, yet he could not taste even the simplest food. However, the true tragedy unfolded the next morning, when his beloved daughter Zoe, as was her daily custom, ran to greet her father. She was his constant pride and greatest joy. A clever 10-year-old girl whose presence filled the palace with cheerful laughter and endless questions about everything she encountered. Without thinking, Midas instinctively reached out to embrace her, as he always did. The transformation was instantaneous and, alas, irreversible. In one moment Zoe was swiftly running towards him, her little face beaming with genuine morning joy, and in the next, she already stood as a perfect golden statue, forever frozen in motion. The expression of happy anticipation on her face was preserved with astonishing precision, but she could no longer utter a word, could not laugh brightly, could not ask her endless questions that had previously delighted Midas more than any treasure. Midas collapsed to his knees beside the golden figure of his daughter. Tears streamed uncontrollably down his face, and in that moment he finally realized the irreplaceable loss he had inflicted upon himself. All the gold in the world was worth nothing compared to the warmth of Zoe's hand resting in his palm, her clear voice saying, "Good morning, Papa," her enthusiastic chatter about the birds she watched from her window. The king spent 3 agonizing days sitting motionless beside the statue of his daughter, unable to eat or sleep, tormented by the echo of his own footsteps reverberating through the once lively, now beautiful but lifeless halls. Everything his eyes fell upon served only as a bitter reminder of what he had lost. The golden roses no longer bloomed. The golden fruit trees never again offered cool shade or nourishing fruit. His golden palace had transformed into a majestic, yet silent, tomb. Finally, Midas, broken by grief, made his way to the river where, according to Dionysus, he could be found if the king ever needed him. Dionysus was already waiting, as if he had foreseen the inevitability of this moment. He seemed not at all surprised to see Midas haggard and plunged into the depths of despair. "I was incredibly foolish," Midas simply uttered. "I beg you, take away this cursed gift. I would rather be the poorest beggar on earth than the richest, but unable to embrace my daughter." Dionysus nodded in response, and in his gesture a sincere though restrained sympathy was evident. "Bathe in the waters of the Pactolus River," he instructed. "Its currents will wash away the golden touch from you, and you will be able to restore the original appearance of everything you have transformed by sprinkling it with this water." Midas rushed to the river and, without removing his clothes, plunged into its waters. The relief that enveloped him as the cursed power left his body was truly inexpressible. He filled vessels with river water and hurried back to his palace, sprinkling it on everything he had managed to transform, saving his daughter for last, for he almost feared to hope for a miracle. But when the life-giving water touched Zoe's golden figure, colour and warmth returned to her, like the sunrise flooding the valley. Her first breath, her first blink, her first confused question about why she had felt so constrained, these sounds were more precious to Midas than all the music in the world. On that memorable evening, as they shared a humble meal of only bread and olives, Zoe, Midas's daughter, questioned her father about his noticeable change. She sensed that he had become different, far more attentive to every word she spoke. In response, Midas recounted to her the nature of desires and the inevitable consequences they bring. He spoke of the profound difference between what the human mind mistakenly takes for desirable and what truly brings joy and satisfaction to the heart. From that day on, Midas's treasury was no longer filled with untold riches. It remained unpretentiously modest. However, his gratitude for all that he possessed grew immeasurably. He began to notice how the rays of the morning sun caressed Zoe's face during breakfast. He savoured the taste of simple food, shared with those he held dear. He spent hours in conversations that did not multiply his earthly treasures, but instead filled each day with profound meaning. The Pactolus River, as legend has it, to this day carries glistening golden specks in its waters, not as an echo of Midas's touch, but as a silent reminder of the lesson learned there, of what truly matters in life. Sometimes in the late hour, when the world falls silent, one might ponder their own aspirations, the fine line separating fleeting sparkle from genuine enrichment of being. What simple joys, perhaps, have been overlooked in the relentless pursuit of things that seemed more valuable? What moments of genuine connection await discovery and deep appreciation, being incomparably more precious than any gold? Reflecting on lost and found treasures, it is now fitting to turn to a narrative that has stirred the minds of many generations for centuries. This is the story of Atlantis, a city that achieved astonishing development, possessing unparalleled beauty and such great pride that it vanished beneath the waters in just one day and night. One can imagine, if one allows the imagination, an island kingdom located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, or, as we now call this place, the Strait of Gibraltar. This was no ordinary island, but a dwelling where human genius created wonders that bordered on magic. The city of Atlantis was designed in the form of perfect concentric circles, each separated by canals that sparkled like precious jewels under the bright Mediterranean sun. The inhabitants of Atlantis were considered descendants of Poseidon himself, the mighty god of the sea, Their founder, Atlas, was granted dominion over this paradisiacal island, and his people inherited both his wisdom and a deep connection to the surrounding ocean. For generations they lived in harmony with the sea. Their ships sailed to distant lands not as vessels of conquerors, but as bearers of trade and enlightenment. What made Atlantis so outstanding was not only its untold riches, though the city possessed unimaginable treasures. The true marvel lay in how the Atlanteans organized their society. They developed systems of governance that skillfully combined individual freedom with communal responsibility. Their schools taught not only practical skills but also profound philosophy and ethics. Their markets operated on principles of fairness, ensuring that every inhabitant had access to what they needed. Atlantis's architecture reflected this universal harmony. In the innermost circle rose the palace and temples, built of white, black, and red stone, quarried on the island itself. These structures were not merely functional. They were designed to evoke admiration and inspiration in all who saw them, their proportions creating a sense of peace and reverent wonder. The middle rings housed gardens and gymnasiums, places where citizens could develop both their bodies and minds. The outer ring was dedicated to workshops and harbours, where the city's practical activities buzzed. However, perhaps most impressive were the Atlanteans' engineering achievements. They created an intricate system of bridges and tunnels that connected all the rings, ensuring efficient movement of people and goods throughout the city. Climate control methods were developed that maintained a comfortable temperature in their buildings year-round. Their harbours were capable of accommodating ships from across the known world, using mechanical devices that made loading and unloading cargo swift and safe. For many centuries, this system functioned flawlessly. Atlantean explorers brought knowledge from distant lands, mathematical concepts from Babylon, astronomical observations from Egypt, philosophical ideas from the burgeoning Greek city-states. But instead of merely passively accepting these foreign ideas, the Atlanteans integrated them with their own traditions, creating unique syntheses that were far more powerful than the simple sum of their component parts. The turning point came gradually, so slowly that most Atlanteans didn't even notice its approach. Success, it turned out, carried its own dangers. As the city grew more prosperous, its citizens began to take their achievements for granted. Systems that once required meticulous maintenance and constant attention were now considered self-sufficient. Values that had guided previous generations began to seem outdated. Unnecessary restrictions on what appeared to be limitless potential. A new generation of leaders emerged. These were people who had grown up surrounded by the wonders of Atlantis, having put no effort into creating them. They looked upon their perfectly organized city and decided it was time for expansion. It was time to share Atlantis's superior customs with the rest of the world, whether that world desired such good or not. These leaders began to speak of Atlantis's great destiny, of its responsibility to guide less developed civilizations. They developed military technologies that were as advanced as their peaceful innovations. Their ships, once welcomed in foreign ports as bearers of trade and knowledge, now arrived as harbingers of conquest. The changes were noticeable even in the city's daily life. Forums where citizens once gathered for open policy discussions transformed into places where only state decisions were announced. Schools began to focus more on technical training than on ethical reflection. Workshops concentrated on producing weapons and instruments of control, rather than creating objects of beauty and utility. But the gods, especially Zeus, watched these developments with growing concern. The Atlanteans had been granted their gifts as a kind of experiment in unlocking human potential. What could humans achieve if given ideal conditions and divine guidance? The experiment was failing not due to external pressure or natural disasters, but because of the choices the Atlanteans themselves were making. Zeus convened a council of the gods to discuss the next steps. Some argued for intervention, for sending signs and warnings that might guide Atlantis back to its original path. Others suggested letting the experiment continue, believing that even failure could teach important lessons. But Zeus made his decision. Atlantis had become a threat not only to other civilizations, but to the very balance of the world. The end came swiftly. Within one day and one night of earthquakes and floods, Atlantis sank beneath the waves. The perfectly designed canals became pathways for the sea's invasion. The magnificent buildings, created to last forever, crumbled under forces beyond their architects' calculations. The ships that were preparing to spread Atlantis's influence across the world turned into wreckage, scattered across the ocean floor. However, this is what makes the story of Atlantis more than just a tale of divine punishment. It is also a story of memory and learning. The destruction was complete, but the knowledge was not entirely lost. Some Atlanteans were on voyages when the catastrophe occurred. Others had migrated to distant colonies years before. These survivors carried with them not only technical knowledge, but also the memory of what their civilization had achieved and why it fell. These scattered remnants of Atlantean wisdom influenced the development of other cultures. Mathematical discoveries found their way into Babylonian astronomy. Architectural principles appeared in Egyptian monuments. Philosophical ideas contributed to the flourishing of Greek thought. But the survivors carefully shared only the constructive aspects of their heritage, preserving warnings about pride and the abuse of power. This is why Plato wrote about Atlantis centuries later, not as a historian recording facts, but as a philosopher exploring ideas. He used this story to examine questions that were as relevant to ancient Athens as they are to us today. What happens when a society's capabilities exceed its wisdom? How does one preserve the values that led to success when success itself becomes commonplace? What responsibilities accompany power, whether individual or collective? Physical Atlantis may have vanished beneath the waves, but its profound meaning continues to surface in new forms. Every civilization that has achieved great things has ultimately faced the same choice as the Atlanteans, to use their achievements as tools for creation or as weapons for domination. As one falls asleep tonight, one might ponder the small Atlantises in one's own life. What systems and relationships have they built that require careful nurturing to remain healthy? What values guide their choices when success tempts them to think that rules no longer apply to them? Perhaps the greatest treasure is not what we build, but the wisdom to preserve the most important of what has been built. Leaving behind reflections on cities condemned to oblivion, the narrative turns to the relentless changes that constantly return to the world. This is a story of an eternal cycle that invariably brings both darkness and radiance, both decay and new birth, manifesting an end that always heralds a beginning. Before us will unfold the myth of the origin of the seasons, and why sometimes the most fateful journeys draw us furthest from our familiar home. Persephone, the tender daughter of Demeter, the mighty goddess of the harvest, grew up in the embrace of endless abundance, generously created by her mother. Their dwelling was a valley where spring seemed to reign supreme and eternally. Flowers there invariably bloomed, trees always bore fruit, and fields were constantly ready for harvest. This place was undoubtedly beautiful, yet perhaps it proved too sheltered, too perfect for a young soul consumed by curiosity for the vast world beyond its borders. Persephone spent her days wandering through sun-drenched meadows in the company of her friends, the ocean nymphs, who had been her inseparable companions since her earliest years. Together they gathered fragrant flowers, skillfully wove garlands from pliable vines, shared stories, and indulged in games whose sole purpose was pure, unadulterated joy. Their lives unfolded in idyllic bliss. However, recently Persephone had been plagued by a strange unease, a premonition that, beyond her mother's protected valley, new, unexplored experiences and profound knowledge awaited her. She began to ask Demeter questions that caused the harvest goddess noticeable discomfort. What lies beneath the earth? What exactly makes plants reach for life? Why are some seeds destined to be buried in darkness before they can break through to the light? What happens to that part of the life cycle that her mother never mentioned? To that decay which seemed to be an indispensable condition for any rebirth? Demeter always hastily changed the subject when such conversations arose. She diligently worked to create a realm where her daughter would never have to face loss or sorrow. The thought that Persephone might be interested in these darker aspects of existence deeply troubled her. She only intensified her vigilance, trying to fill her daughter's days with pleasant activities that would distract her from such unsettling reflections. But Hades, the stern lord of the underworld, watched Persephone closely from his distant and gloomy realm. He saw her questioning nature, her dissatisfaction with simple answers, her courage in asking difficult questions. Unlike her mother, he did not find these qualities disturbing. On the contrary, he found them delightful. Here was one who could grasp that darkness and light were not enemies but inseparable partners in the grand dance of existence. The day everything changed began quite ordinarily. Persephone was gathering flowers with her companions in a meadow that seemed especially enchanting that morning. The grass was soft under their feet, and the air was warm and sweet with the intoxicating scent of blooming narcissus. Persephone was drawn as if by a magnet to one flower, a narcissus that shone brighter than the others, its petals captivating the eye, hypnotically catching the sunlight. As she bent down to pluck this extraordinary flower, the earth beneath her feet suddenly split open. But instead of falling, she felt unseen hands gently lift her, carrying her down through layers of soil and stone into caves that sparkled with precious gems and metals. The journey was frightening, yes, but also astonishing. She saw parts of the world that no mortal had ever seen. She arrived in the underworld not as a captive, but as an honored guest in a palace, surpassing in splendor anything she could have imagined. Its halls were carved from black marble veined with silver, and illuminated by flames that cast no shadows and emitted warmth without smoke. Here, too, were gardens, but they were unlike any in the upper world. Plants that bloomed in darkness, trees bearing fruit of silver and gold, and flowers that, instead of fragrance, emitted soft, melodious sounds. Hades greeted her with marked courtesy, explaining that he had brought her here, not for selfish reasons. He believed she was the only one who could truly comprehend both worlds, the realm of growth and abundance above, and the realm of rest and transformation below. He offered to show her the workings of his domain, the systems that ensured renewal in the upper world. What Persephone saw contradicted everything she had been taught about death and endings. The underworld turned out to be not a place of punishment, but a vast recycling system where souls found repose and renewed themselves between lives. She observed the process by which the energy of completed lives was transformed into the potential for new growth. She learned about the delicate balance necessary to sustain life on the surface. Meanwhile, in the upper world, Demeter discovered her daughter's disappearance and was overcome with frantic grief and rage. She abandoned her duties as goddess of the harvest, wandering inconsolably across the earth in search of Persephone. Without Demeter's nurturing attention, the crops began to wither. Trees ceased to bear fruit. Even the grass began to fade and die. The eternal spring of Demeter's realm gave way to something the world had never experienced: a barren cold, a season of scarcity and weary waiting. Mortals began to suffer, for food became scarce, and the very earth seemed to refuse to support life. They prayed to the gods for help, but Demeter was deaf to their pleas. She would not restore abundance until her daughter returned to her. Zeus, observing the unfolding of this universal crisis, finally intervened. He sent Hermes, the swift messenger of the gods, to negotiate with Hades for Persephone's return. But when Hermes arrived in the underworld, he found a complex situation. Persephone had indeed partaken of the underworld's food, not because she was tricked or forced, but because she had consciously chosen to taste a few pomegranate seeds, accepting the consequences of that act. More importantly, Persephone realized she did not wish to return permanently to her former life. The knowledge she had gained in the underworld had changed her to her core. She now understood why she had felt restless in her mother's protected valley. She sensed the incompleteness of her experience, having lived only one half of the life cycle. The solution reached as a result of these negotiations satisfied everyone, though it required sacrifices from each participant. Persephone would spend part of each year in the underworld with Hades, learning the mysteries of death and transformation. For the rest of the year, she would return to the upper world, bringing with her the wisdom she had gained below. When Persephone returned for her first reunion with Demeter, both mother and daughter had been transformed by their separation. Demeter realized that her protective love, taken to an extreme, could become its own prison. Persephone, meanwhile, had gained knowledge that made her a more whole person, one who understood both joy and sorrow, both growth and rest, both beginning and end. Their reunion restored abundance to the earth, but it was a different abundance than before, more complex, more resilient, more realistic. The world now experienced the changing of the seasons. Times of plenty alternated with times of scarcity. Periods of growth were followed by periods of rest. This was not a punishment or a loss, but a more mature understanding of how natural cycles function. During the months Persephone resided on the surface, the earth bloomed in spring and flourished in summer. In her absence, when she dwelt below, autumn brought a bountiful harvest, and winter, the necessary repose. Farmers learned to work in accordance with these rhythms, not against them, preserving the abundance of the growing season to sustain themselves during periods of scarcity. But the deeper gift of Persephone's journey was the wisdom she brought back about the necessity of difficult experiences. She learned that some kinds of growth are possible only in darkness, that certain forms of strength develop exclusively through overcoming hardships, and that some kinds of understanding come only through experiencing loss and subsequent recovery. She became a kind of guide for mortals facing their own inevitable. Descents. Times when life called them to leave familiar comforts and venture into uncharted territories. Her story reminded them that such journeys, however frightening they might seem, often led to discoveries that made the travelers more whole, more capable, more truly alive. The ancient Greeks, who passed down this story from generation to generation, deeply understood something important about the development of the human personality. They realized that one cannot remain forever in the sheltered springs of childhood. That maturity requires reconciliation with the cycles of loss and recovery, and that wisdom often comes from voluntarily entering experiences that may initially seem threatening or undesirable. As the seasons of individual life continue their ancient rotation, one can ponder what Persephone learned in her descent. Sometimes the deepest growth occurs in the darkest places. Endings make way for new beginnings, and the courage to face difficult transitions often leads to discoveries more valuable than the comfort left behind. What seeds of opportunity might await their sprouting in the coming seasons of individual experience? From Persephone's voluntary descent into darkness, the narrative now shifts to another journey underground. However, this journey is driven not by curiosity, but by a love so profound that it dared to challenge the fundamental laws of existence itself. This is the story of Orpheus, whose music could move stones and tame wild beasts, and whose love for Eurydice led him to attempt the impossible. Orpheus, son of one of the 9 Muses, goddesses who inspired art and knowledge, displayed astonishing musical talent from an early age. When his fingers touched the strings of the lyre, a beautiful instrument created by Apollo himself, even rivers slowed their impetuous flow, eager to catch every sound. Trees humbly bowed their branches, lest they miss a single note, and the fiercest beasts sat in silence, captivated by melodies that seemed to contain all the joy and sorrow of the world. His music not only captivated with beauty, it possessed a transformative power. Farmers noticed that their crops grew more abundant when echoes of Orpheus's rehearsals reached them. Shepherds found that their flocks remained calm and healthy when his songs drifted across the hills. Even in cities, people said that disputes were resolved more easily, and daily worries seemed less burdensome on days when Orpheus performed in the squares. However, despite the joy his music brought to those around him, Orpheus himself often felt lonely. He could move entire crowds to tears or laughter, could inspire them to good deeds or acts of courage. But he passionately longed to find someone who understood not only his music but also the man behind it, someone who saw in him something more than just a conduit of beautiful sounds. Such a person he found in Eurydice, a wood nymph whose own gifts perfectly complemented his. While Orpheus was capable of creating music that expressed any emotion, Eurydice possessed an intuitive understanding of the natural world, allowing her to hear meanings in his compositions that others missed. She could listen to one of his melodies and unerringly determine whether he had composed it at dawn or dusk, whether he had observed the flight of eagles or the swimming of fish, whether his heart was full of hope or touched by melancholy. Their courtship resembled a long, tender song. They roamed the forests together, where Orpheus played softly, and Eurydice pointed out to him how different creatures reacted to various musical phrases. She taught him to weave natural sounds, birdsong, the rustle of wind in the leaves, the gurgle of water over stones into his compositions. He, in turn, showed her how human emotions could be expressed through rhythm and melody in ways that words could never convey. Their wedding was celebrated by both gods and mortals. Apollo provided the musical accompaniment for the ceremony, though he admitted that his own playing seemed simple compared to what his pupil had achieved. The 9 muses were present, each contributing her art to make the celebration perfect. Hymen, the god of marriage, blessed their union with prayers for long happiness and shared creativity. For a short time, their life together was exactly as they had imagined it. They built a modest home in a grove where the acoustics were ideal for music making. Mornings began with Orpheus composing while Eurydice tended the garden. Each felt the rhythm of the other, and their separate pursuits created a harmony far greater than either could achieve alone. Evenings were spent exchanging the day's discoveries, a new melody Orpheus had devised, or an unusual bird call Eurydice had learned to imitate. But their happiness was observed by others, and not all of them wished them well. Aristaeus, a minor god who had long desired Eurydice, watched their well-being with growing resentment. He had offered Eurydice gifts and attention before her marriage, and her gentle but firm rejections wounded his pride more than he cared to admit. One afternoon, while Orpheus was away consulting with other musicians, Aristaeus approached Eurydice in her garden. His initial attempts at conversation were politely but clearly rebuffed. As he became more insistent, suggesting she deserved a better husband than a mere musician, Eurydice began to retreat towards the forest, hoping to lose him among the trees where she could move more easily than he. In her haste, trying to escape, she stepped on a venomous snake sleeping in the tall grass. The bite was swift and fatal. By the time Orpheus returned and found her, she had already begun her journey to the underworld, leaving behind only the fading warmth of a body no longer inhabited by the soul he loved. Orpheus's grief was unlike anything the world had ever experienced. His lamentations were so heartbreaking that they affected the very natural order. Trees shed their leaves out of season. Rivers overflowed their banks as if weeping. Wild animals emerged from their hiding places, not drawn by the beauty of his music as before, but pulled by a sorrow so profound that it seemed to call out to every creature who had ever experienced loss. For days, Orpheus could do nothing but sit by Eurydice's grave, playing melodies that expressed his deep sorrow. But gradually, a new idea began to form in his mind. His music had always been able to achieve the impossible. Why should death be different from any other obstacle? If his songs could move stones and calm storms, perhaps they could also touch the hearts of the gods who ruled the underworld. Against the advice of everyone he knew, Orpheus decided to descend into Hades' realm and plead for Eurydice's return. He made his way to one of the hidden entrances to the underworld, a cave so deep and dark that no mortal had ever returned from it. But Orpheus entered with only his lyre, trusting that his music would protect him where weapons and armor would be useless. The journey through the underworld was like traveling through a landscape of solidified grief. He passed through caves where the walls wept eternally, through rivers flowing with the tears of those who mourned, through valleys where mist formed from final breaths. But wherever he went, his music preceded him, and the inhabitants of this realm, creatures accustomed to eternal sorrow, found themselves experiencing something they had almost forgotten: hope. Even Cerberus, the three-headed dog guarding the gates of Hades, was moved by Orpheus's lament. Instead of attacking the living intruder, the great beast lowered all three of its heads and allowed its eyes to close, lulled into peaceful sleep by melodies that spoke of a love so strong it transcended the boundaries between life and death. When Orpheus finally reached the throne room of Hades and Persephone, his music had already announced his arrival. The rulers of the underworld sat waiting, knowing they were about to hear a plea unlike any ever made in their domain. Orpheus played for them the entire story of his love for Eurydice, their meeting, their courtship, their brief happiness, and his devastating loss. But more than that, he played the music of love itself, melodies that reminded even these divine beings of the connections they cherished, the losses they had endured, and how caring for someone else gives life its deepest meaning. Persephone, who understood better than most the pain of separation from those we love, openly wept as she listened. Hades, usually unmoved by mortal pleas, found himself recalling his own longing during the months Persephone dwelt in the upper world. For the first time in the history of their realm, the rulers of the dead agreed to release a soul back to life. But their gift came with conditions. Eurydice could return with Orpheus to the upper world, but during their journey from the underworld, he must not look back at her. He had to believe she was following him. He had to trust what he could not see. He had to demonstrate that his love was strong enough to act on faith, rather than demanding constant confirmation. The journey back began with joy. Orpheus heard Eurydice's footsteps behind him. He could feel her presence as he always could when she was near. They retraced their path through the caves and valleys of the underworld, moving steadily towards the light that marked the boundary between the realm of the dead and the land of the living. But as they ascended the final passage to the surface, doubt began to creep into Orpheus's mind. The footsteps behind him seemed to grow fainter. The sense of Eurydice's presence became less certain. What if the gods had tricked him? What if he was ascending to the light alone, while Eurydice remained below? What if his faith was misplaced, and his beloved was even now being dragged back into the depths, where he would never again be allowed to enter? Just as the cave entrance appeared, just as the sunlight of the upper world began to touch his face, Orpheus's faith failed him. He turned to ensure Eurydice was truly there, and she was, for just a moment. He saw her face, saw her reaching out to him with love and understanding. But in that same instant, she began to fade, recalled back to the underworld because he had broken the god's condition. Her last words to him were not a reproach, but an expression of love. She understood why he had looked back, forgave him for the doubt that ruined them both. As she vanished back into the darkness, she smiled with the same gentle understanding that had first drawn him to her. Orpheus emerged from the underworld alone. His second loss was even more devastating than the first, because he knew he himself was its cause. He tried to return to the cave, but the entrance sealed itself. The mercy of the gods, once rejected, would not be offered again. He lived the rest of his life as a wandering musician. His songs now carried such a depth of sorrow and wisdom that they made them even more powerful than before. People came from distant lands to hear him play, not because his music brought them joy, but because it helped them understand their own losses, their own struggles with faith and doubt, their own experience of a love so profound that the possibility of loss became almost unbearable. The narrative of Orpheus and Eurydice has been passed down through generations for millennia, for it touches upon something profound and universal in the human experience. Every individual faces moments when they must act based on inner conviction rather than complete certainty. Often, love itself demands faith in what cannot be seen or proven. In such moments, the temptation to turn back, to seek comfort or confirmation, when only unwavering faith is expected of us, is well known. As the day draws to a close and one falls into contemplation, one might reflect on the profound truths this ancient legend reveals about the essence of trust and the nature of doubt. What life paths of an individual require not concrete guarantees, but deep, unwavering faith. What relationships call upon a person to believe in their authenticity and existence, even if tangible confirmations of their reality are not always available. Perhaps the most magnificent symphony that the human spirit creates is born not from the sounds of musical instruments, but from the unyielding courage to continue moving towards the light, even when there is no possibility of turning back to ensure that love still steadfastly follows us.